Morning, gentlemen. Today we will review this book, Thoughts on Pakistan, written by Dr. Ambedkar. It's a worth reading book for all those who wish to understand the genesis of Pakistan as to how it came about and was it inevitable to happen. Could we as a society prepare ourselves better for the inevitable partition instead of getting emotional about the partition? This book looks at the whole issue of creation of Pakistan in a very holistic manner. Because this was written when Pakistan was just a demand of Muslims and had not come about. This book is also very essential for those who are more driven by ideology rather than logic and rational. And as a result, we start blaming each other for the partition instead of looking at in a logical manner and holistically. I'm sure this book that was written in 1941, few months after the Lahore Resolution, in which Jinnah had announced openly that the Muslim demand, and he said that the Hindus and Muslims are two nations and they cannot live together. The book has 350 pages and so not very thick. It can be read within a week, right? And it has been divided into very logical 5 parts, as a lawyer does. Dr. Ambedkar was a lawyer. As a lawyer does, draws his pleadings. So he fought the case for both the Muslim case for Pakistan, right, and the Hindu case why Pakistan should be opposed, and then he says, what if Pakistan is not created? What can we do then? So these parts are: part 1 deals with the Muslim case for Pakistan. Part 2 discusses about Hindu case against Pakistan. And part 3, what if not Pakistan? And part 4 talks about Pakistan and the Malays in Hindus and Muslim communities. He discusses in this chapter the social evils that exist within both the communities, and whereas both sides are more concerned about the composition of legislature, the constitution, and the political power. So he says it cannot be said with certainty that will political power be used for eradicating social evils, or political power must be acquired after social evils are removed. He sees that Hindu-Muslim problem today, that is in 1940s, is also a symptom of social evils that prevail in their respective communities. Now, right in the beginning, he informs the reader that it was in 1935. Now, why it is important, this date, 1935? Because most of us think that the Pakistan problem started from 1940 Lahore Resolution. No. He informs the reader right in the beginning of the book that it was in 1935 that this Pakistan movement started with a book of Chaudhry Rahmat Ali, Now or Never. This was published in England. It is a small pamphlet kind of thing in which he professed for a separate nation for Muslims. Right? And so in chapter 1, he begins with as to why Muslims are demanding for a separate nation for themselves and the demands of Muslim League in detail. Demands that came after the Lahore Resolution, from the Lahore Resolution of 1940. So he in this chapter discusses the entire course of events, political and social, that took place right from historical background, right, and including the partition of Bengal until 1940s, right. So he covered all the events, including the historical events that the Muslim invaders came, destroyed temples and all that. And then he discusses about that created a sense of need amongst the Muslims and the minorities, or Muslims or minorities, to create a separate nation for themselves. He questions those who dismiss the demands of Muslims and other minorities by asking a question that such leaders must clarify, are the Hindus going to be the ruling race and the Muslims and other minorities to be the subject races under Swaraj? If that be so, then he says the unity cannot be achieved. In part 2, he, while discussing the Hindu case against Pakistan, he says where the Hindus blame Muslims, that the Muslims are trying to break their country, which is ancient. So Hindus, he says, must understand that the unity does not exist now. Yes, undoubtedly, he said, during Mauryas or Guptas, and as per the records of Yun Sang, India was a big empire comprising of some 80 odd kingdoms, and emperor enjoyed suzerainty over many smaller kingdoms, and that were spread right till Kabul in north and Deccan in south. But that was, he said, 1,000 years ago. You cannot today, claim what was once part of an empire. And he gives an example of how, Italy, some newspapers in Italy, after Italy captured Tripoli, which is in Libya, and started describing this capture as recovering the fatherland, because once Tripoli was a province of Roman Empire and surely they could not retain it. Similarly, the entire region, he says, of Macedonia, Alexander, is claimed by Greeks on one hand and by Bulgaria on the other, because once Macedonia was part of their respective empires. Now it's easy to understand for the present generation, how and why China claims Arunachal Pradesh and Tibet as their part. Because once, at some point of time in history, the kings of these kingdoms might be paying tribute to the emperor of China. So he is claiming, China is claiming as their part. So he says the same logic applies here, and quotes a very renowned historian and philosopher, Toynbee, to convey to the Hindus that they have to guard against such sentiments that arise from some historical facts and the conditions that existed then, but they don't exist now. So to understand, Dr. Ambedkar's logic better, I will draw this, bring out another example. Imagine Italians staking claim over Britain, as Caesar had captured larger territories of Britain in 55 BC, and the Romans ruled over Britain for almost 400 years. So it's the same logic, He finally says that this demand of Pakistan cannot be wished away by using similes and metaphors. Probably that time in 1940s when this demand जो पाकिस्तान की थी वो जब छोड़ी जिन्ना ने स्टार्ट की, तो बहुत सारे अखबारों में और आता होगा और लोग भी बोलते होंगे, इस तरह के मेटाफर्स को यूज करते होंगे, लाइक यू डू नॉट कट द हेड टू क्योर हेडेक. आपको सिर दर्द होता तो आप सिर नहीं काट देते. तो probably Hindus that time might be using this metaphor. Or you do not cut a child into two if the two mothers are engaged in fighting over a claim over the child. तो बच्चे को दो पार्ट में नहीं हुआ कि दो माँ लड़ रही हैं तो एक तू ले जा एक तू ले जा. So some Hindus might be using it. Then he says कि if 90% Muslims sentiments are behind Pakistan, then you cannot smash this idea and ridicule it and trivialize it. He says on the issue of Hindus asking what grievances Muslims have and why should they demand a separate country, he says a student of history should know that nationalism is enough cause for the creation of a separate nation state. And when it comes to Muslim grievances, they are in plenty, and then he lists out the grievances in this part. One of them, he says that the British removed the Muslims who were ruling them, who were the rulers, and made them as subjects. So is it unnatural now? Is it an unnatural demand if the Muslims seek an escape now from this intolerable situation? Very logical. Finally, in this part 1, he discusses about will the creation of Pakistan bring communal peace in the subcontinent? And then he says कि communal award जो था जो फर्स्ट राउंड टेबल कॉन्फ्रेंस के बाद अनाउंस हुआ. Now, despite the opposition by Hindus, and first round table conference, Congress ने boycott की थी, and Hindu Mahasabha, Dr. Ambedkar and all those people, 30 odd political party leaders had attended that. So, which was boycotted by Congress. So, uske despite the opposition by Hindus, Hindu Mahasabha, the communal award was given, and in this communal award, a situation जो आई, जो separate electorate और weightage को लेके, वो इस तरह की जन्मी कि हिंदू प्रोविंसेस में मुस्लिम माइनॉरिटीज हो सकते थे और मुस्लिम प्रोविंसेस में हिंदू माइनॉरिटीज हो सकते थे. सो ही सेज इट, डॉक्टर अंबेडकर सेज इट इम्प्लाइज कि इफ मुस्लिम माइनॉरिटीज इन हिंदू प्रोविंसेस आर टेरनाइज्ड, then it gives a handle to Muslim provinces to tyrannize Hindu minorities, right? So this problem of अगर यही present boundaries adopt होती हैं for partition of India, then this problem of minorities will always remain. Okay, so then he says that today Hindus, for the sake of unity, political unity, may make many compromises. We know what all compromises Congress was making to Jinnah. But then he says, but in future, it may lead to further such demands, like वो डिमांड्स आज जो आप कॉम्प्रोमाइज कर रहा हो जिन्ना को देके मुस्लिम लीग को, वो डिमांड्स आगे चल के जो हैं और ज़्यादा हो सकती हैं, लाइक कोटा इन आर्म फोर्सेस, कि आपके इतने हमारे इतनी परसेंटेज, डिमांड्स लाइक आर्मी चीफ हिंदू तो एयर चीफ हमारा, और रोटेशन, quota in civil administration, etc., etc. It can go on and on, in jobs also, like we have today the reservation in jobs. The same thing could have happened then, agar Pakistan nahi bana hota. And then many other religious communities will also join in, and they will also start demanding for their quota in legislature and executive and in armed forces and so on. So India, he said, will become a mess. So he is indicating that let Pakistan be made, let Pakistan be created, let there be partition, and India, then the other India, that is the Hindu India, then makes its own constitution and is governed by that constitution. He also criticizes those Hindus who claim that Hindus and Muslims have the same customs. In order to bring up, give a feeling that there is a social unity. तो बहुत सारे लोग उस वक्त लिख रहे होंगे या बोल रहे होंगे कि हमारे कस्टम्स बहुत मिलते जुलते हैं, और आज भी हम देखते हैं कि वो लोग भी शादी के बहुत सारी रस्में सेम हैं. So Dr. Ambedkar says that there is no doubt that both of us, that the Hindus and Muslims belong to the same race and they speak the same language, right? Like he says there is a lot of similarity between a Tamil Brahman and a Tamil Muslim. But a Tamil Brahman is not similar to a Punjabi Brahman, right? So he says this uniformity of language, customs, practice is purely, is caused by some other reasons and not due to any conscious effort made by the two communities to adopt similar customs. अर्थात कोई हमारे अंदर से कोई ये भावना नहीं पैदा हो रही कि हम दोनों एक कुछ कस्टम्स एक साथ एक जैसे रखें, बट ये जो कस्टम्स की सिमिलैरिटी है वो हुआ है, पहला रीजन इम्पार्शियल कन्वर्जन, मतलब बंदा तो कन्वर्ट हो गया लेकिन उसने कुछ कस्टम्स लेके वहां चला गया, राइट? सो कोई कॉन्शियस एफर्ट नहीं है, दिल से कोई वो भावना नहीं है कि हमारे कस्टम्स सेम होने चाहिए, कन्वर्जन हो चुका है. And second, he says the common environment to which both have been subjected to for centuries. मतलब एक तमिल ब्राह्मण और तमिल मुस्लिम एक साथ एक ही एनवायरनमेंट में एक ही भाषा बोलते हुए जब रह रहे हैं बरसों से, सो ये उसी के कारण है. And we should not boast about it just for the sake of bringing social unity. So Dr. Ambedkar, perhaps the first and the only one who could foresee the complexity of the whole situation in all its dimensions, and therefore he suggested that the constitution by itself cannot be a guarantee to safeguard the rights of minorities, and suggested that those scoffing at the idea of exchanging or shifting of population, क्योंकि minority दोनों साइड, Muslim provinces में Hindu minorities and Hindu provinces में Muslim minorities, and this all this can lead to very complex problem later on. And so he says, first he says, let's tweak the border, कहीं इधर उधर बॉर्डर करके जिससे एक पार्टीशन हो तो एक होमोजीनियस मुस्लिम नेशन हो, एक होमोजीनियस हिंदू नेशन हो जाए, एंड देन जो पॉपुलेशन हो माइनॉरिटीज की वो एक्सचेंज कर ली जाए, right? And then he gives a problem, gives an example of Greece, Turkey and Bulgaria, right? Because this minority problem can, he cited, can lead to a lot of problems later on. So therefore, because this may move at some point of time, moving of millions of people from one habitat to another, and it happened, 1947, people were moved. Rather, they moved themselves because of the fear and murder and bloodshed. And these three countries, Greece, Turkey and Bulgaria, realizing this problem, complex problem, they joined hands to shift population. And it was a tedious job because people have to be shifted from one habitat to another. And that's how they achieve communal peace. So then, thereafter he discusses about the trust deficit. And first he blames the upper caste Hindus because they have always been exploitative and they monopolized education, which led to monopolization of wealth and power, and gave number of examples of Sindh, because Sindh was once part of, Bombay and Sindh were the same presidency, Bombay Sindh presidency, and the Hindus demanded for separation because they thought they will get more government jobs. And later on, when the separate electorate thing came, they realized they will be in minority, so they started opposing the separation. Now, the same thing happened in Bengal, in Kerala and elsewhere. So, upper caste Hindus, he says, have been exploitative and therefore they cannot be trusted. And the second, he says that both Hindu Mahasabha and Congress, although Hindu Mahasabha is rustic, rude, and brutal in its actions, and Congress is more diplomatic and polite, that's the only difference. Otherwise, both are seen by Muslims as Hindu parties, right? And so therefore, they can never win the trust of Muslims, and there will always be a trust deficit. And then he discusses about tweaking the borders, like I said, so that the partition can take place and we can create a homogeneous Pakistan and homogeneous Hindu India. Thereafter, in part 3, he discusses about the Hindu alternative to Pakistan, because many Hindus and leaders must be giving this alternative to resolve this Hindu-Muslim problem and the Pakistan problem. So here he discusses at length about Savarkar and other Hindu nationalists, his party Hindu Mahasabha. They were also suggesting the solution. So he says Savarkar and Hindu nationalists have clearly stated that they will establish a Hindu Rashtra and oppose Pakistan. How they would oppose, nobody knows. So Dr. Ambedkar goes on and says, to understand Savarkar, one needs to understand the basic concept behind it. He says, when Savarkar says Hindus are a nation by themselves, it naturally means that Muslims are a separate nation too. So Dr. Ambedkar says, strange it may appear, he has written this, strange it may appear, Mr. Savarkar and Mr. Jinnah, instead of being opposed to each other on one versus two nations issue, they are in complete agreement about it. Both agree and insist that there are two nations in India, one Muslim and the other Hindu. They only differ in the terms and conditions as to how these two nations, that is Hindu India and Muslim India, they can live together. Jinnah says it should be divided, whereas Savarkar says although there are two nations in India, but it will not be divided, the two nations will live in one country under one constitution, and the constitution will be such that Hindu nation will be enabled to occupy a predominant position and Muslims will be made to live in the subordinate position. So Dr. Ambedkar says, if Congress is vague about minority rights, Savarkar is illogical and strange and is creating a most dangerous situation for the safety and security of India. And what is difficult is that Savarkar believes that his is the right way. So then further he goes on and says, Mr. Savarkar has taken this old Austria and old Turkey as his model for Swaraj model जो जिस पे सावरकर ने बुक लिखी है, little knowing that old Austria and old Turkey are no more, and as he is fond of studying the history in past, must know that the very model that he is suggesting became the cause of ruin of old Turkey and old Austria. So now he says, because there is no passion and desire for unity and for fusion between Hindus and Muslims, no wonder that Mr. Gandhi, after having tried his best to achieve this unity between Hindus and Muslims, has failed, because these riots which are taken place, number of riots had taken place, thousands of people were killed in these 2 decades. They prove that Mr. Gandhi has failed in achieving the unity. Now, then he asked, he said, how can, when a Gujarati takes pride in being a Gujarati, then an Indian, a Maharashtrian takes pride in being a Maharashtrian, Punjabi and Madrasi as a Madrasi, and a Bengali as a Bengali, how can Hindus accuse Muslims for lack of national feelings when Muslim says, I am a Muslim first? When you yourself are first, what? Gujarati first, Bengali first. In such a situation, he says it is irrelevant to ask how Muslims can be made to join Hindus. The question, the main question is, how can the two work together with one constitution? He said political unity is worth nothing if there is no social unity. And then he gives examples of old Austria, Turkey, Czechoslovakia, the Roman Empire, as to how this political unity without social unity is not workable. And then he finally pleads that it will be a greatest folly to suppose or to assume that if Pakistan is buried for the moment by making some compromises, it will never raise its head. He goes on to say that if Pakistan is not created today, the same Hindus will demand creation of Pakistan tomorrow. This he wrote in 1941. We must read this book also along with his another book, Pakistan or Partition of India. Now finally in his epilogue he says he has addressed a large part of his arguments for the Hindus. And he says that the false sentiments, false illusions have prevented the Hindus from receiving fresh light. He wanted Hindus to be practical, agree to the partition by tweaking the borders so that you create homogeneous Pakistan and homogeneous India, and plan in advance for the exchange of population. My view is, although this book is blunt, logical, but Dr. Ambedkar could suggest all this because he was not directly involved and was watching this whole. He was not in a position where he could influence decisions, influence the masses of this country, and so was watching this game being played from the sidelines. And because of this, he could write all this. All that happened in 1947, 48, right? Happened as Dr. Ambedkar predicted in his book, but it happened with a lot of bloodshed, and both sides unfortunately accuse each other. Savarkar and his followers blame Congress for division, and Congress blames Savarkar and Jinnah for the partition. I really doubt under such hyper nationalistic sentiments, which Dr. Ambedkar had advised to Hindus to guard against, any leader at that time could dare to convince the masses. There could be no leader then, in 1940s, 43, 44 or so, after having tried convincing Jinnah, and who could have said, let's part ways, let's prepare for the partition and start shifting people. I don't think so. Any leader who could influence the masses and could convince the masses like this could have said this, right? So this book is must read, because particularly for those who are driven by ideologies rather than logic and rational. You will get to understand how Pakistan came about, and it was inevitable, but we could have probably prevented a lot of bloodshed. Okay, Thank you. Jai Hind.